There's a photograph that never made the front pages. March 2022. Senior American officials sitting across from Venezuelan representatives in Caracas. No cameras at the arrival. No official statements afterward. Just quiet conversations about oil, sanctions, and what it would take to bring Venezuelan crude back to American refineries. Most people never heard about that meeting. Those who did probably forgot about it within a news cycle. But that photograph tells you everything you need to know about the gap between public rhetoric and private calculation in American foreign policy. And here's what makes it relevant today. Those same officials who sat in that room negotiating energy deals are now reading classified intelligence about how the regime they were bargaining with actually operates. What they're learning would make those 2022 conversations look very different in hindsight. But we'll get to that. Stay with me. I've covered Latin American affairs for 3 decades. I've watched administrations from both parties publicly condemn dictators while privately negotiating with them. I've seen sanctions imposed with great fanfare and quietly loosened when circumstances required it. And I've learned that the most important conversations in international relations are usually the ones that don't generate headlines. So let's talk about what Nicolás Maduro has actually told the American government over the years. Not the propaganda version. Not the simplified narrative that plays well on cable news. The real story, the one that starts with diplomatic chess moves but ends in federal courtrooms in New York with witnesses describing cocaine shipments and murder. Because here's what most people don't understand yet. While diplomats were discussing barrel counts and sanction relief, prosecutors were building a criminal case. And the star witness? He used to run Venezuela's military intelligence. They call him El Pollo, the chicken, and what he's prepared to testify about makes those diplomatic cables look like theater. But let's establish the context first, because you need to understand how the game was played before you can appreciate how it's ending. The conventional wisdom says Maduro is isolated, irrelevant, clinging to power through repression alone. The conventional wisdom is wrong, and understanding why requires looking at what actually happened versus what we were told happened. Let's start with what we know. Since 2017, the United States has maintained that Maduro's government is illegitimate. Sanctions were imposed. Assets were frozen. American companies were barred from doing business with Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA. The stated goal was regime change, or at least regime collapse. Put enough economic pressure on Caracas, the thinking went, and either the military would defect or the population would rise up. That was 7 years ago. Maduro is still there. Or rather, he was until very recently. And the reason he lasted so long, and the reason his arrest required a military operation rather than a diplomatic handover, tells you everything about what we're actually dealing with here. What changed wasn't Maduro's grip on power. What changed was the calculus in Washington. February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Global oil markets convulsed. Crude prices spiked above $100 per barrel. American consumers started paying over $5 per gallon at the pump in some states. And suddenly, the same administration that had condemned Maduro as a dictator was sending delegations to Caracas to discuss oil. The public justification was about freeing American hostages held in Venezuelan prisons. That happened. But anyone who thinks senior American officials flew to Venezuela purely for a hostage negotiation doesn't understand how foreign policy actually works. You don't send your top people for single-issue conversations when geopolitical stakes are this high. What Maduro told those American officials was straightforward. Venezuela has oil. Lots of it. The largest proven reserves in the world. Over 300 billion barrels. Yes, the infrastructure is degraded. Yes, production has collapsed. But with American technology, with sanctions relief, with access to international financing, those numbers could change. The pitch wasn't about democracy or human rights. It was pure transactional realpolitik. You need oil. We have oil. Let's make a deal. But here's what that pitch concealed, and what prosecutors are now prepared to prove in court. The same government making these offers was simultaneously running one of the largest drug trafficking operations in the Western Hemisphere. The same officials discussing energy policy were coordinating cocaine shipments. The same regime seeking legitimacy was operating torture facilities. And the evidence isn't circumstantial. It's documentary. It's testimonial. And it's about to become public. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Maduro wasn't negotiating from weakness. He was negotiating from a position that, while not strong in absolute terms, was stronger than Washington wanted to admit, because Venezuela had already found other buyers. China, India, Russia, Iran. Smaller transactions, yes, often through complicated sanctions evasion schemes, but enough to keep the regime afloat, enough to prevent the collapse that sanctions were designed to trigger. This is where historical context matters, and where we start to see patterns that explain why the situation got as bad as it did. American sanctions regimes have a mixed record at best. Cuba has been under embargo for over 60 years. The Castro regime outlasted 11 American presidents. Iran has faced sanctions for decades. The Islamic Republic is still there. North Korea remains isolated and nuclear-armed. The track record suggests that authoritarian regimes are far more resilient to economic pressure than democratic theory would predict, especially when those regimes are willing to do things that democracies won't. And Maduro's regime, as we're about to explore in detail, was willing to do quite a lot. Maduro understood this resilience. More importantly, he understood that time was on his side. Every month the sanctions continued was another month his government survived. Every month was another month his security apparatus remained loyal, or at least complicit. Every month was another month opposition forces fragmented and weakened. Survival itself became a form of victory. So when American officials came calling in 2022, desperate to find alternative oil supplies to replace Russian crude, Maduro had something Washington needed. And he knew it. The initial conversations led to limited sanctions relief. In November 2022, the Biden administration authorized Chevron to resume operations in Venezuela under strict conditions. Production would be limited. Revenue would be controlled. But it was a crack in the wall, a signal that pragmatism could override principle when economic necessity demanded it. The market response was telling. Venezuelan bonds, trading at 15 cents on the dollar, jumped to 25 cents. Analysts started publishing reports about potential upside if sanctions were fully lifted. Oil traders began factoring Venezuelan supply back into their calculations. But here's what separates informed analysis from speculation. And here's where we start moving from the diplomatic surface to what was actually happening underneath. The conversations between Caracas and Washington weren't just about oil. They were about regional stability, about migration, about China's growing influence in Latin America. And they were being conducted with people who, according to sealed indictments that are now public, were running a criminal enterprise. Think about that for a moment. U.S. officials negotiating energy policy with individuals who prosecutors allege were simultaneously coordinating drug shipments and ordering political assassinations. This gets to something fundamental that most coverage misses. The Maduro government wasn't a normal authoritarian regime that happened to engage in corruption. According to the evidence that's emerging, and I want you to remember this point, because we're going to return to it with specific details, it was a criminal organization that used the apparatus of the state as cover. There's a difference, and that difference explains why the story ends not with a negotiated transition but with a military raid and federal charges. The January 2023 negotiations in Mexico City illustrated how sophisticated this operation had become. Opposition groups, the Maduro government, and international observers sat down to discuss electoral conditions. The United States offered further sanctions relief in exchange for commitments to free and fair elections. Maduro's team agreed to some demands, rejected others, and generally played for time, because they already knew what they were planning to do in the 2024 election. And what they actually did, the specific mechanics of how they pulled it off, is something most reporting has gotten completely wrong. But before we get into those mechanics, before we show you the documentation that proves exactly how the fraud worked, you need to understand one more piece of context. You need to understand what happens to people who threaten this system. Because the real enforcement mechanism wasn't diplomatic pressure or economic sanctions. It was fear, systematic, institutionalized fear backed by torture, disappearance, and in some cases, death. There's a building in Caracas called El Helicoide. It was supposed to be a shopping mall. It became the headquarters of Venezuelan intelligence. And what happened inside that building, what the United Nations documented, what survivors described, what is now part of the official record, explains how a regime losing an election by 40 points managed to claim victory. We're going to walk through that building. We're going to show you the numbers, the names, the methods. But first, we need to complete the diplomatic picture, because the contrast between what was being said in negotiating rooms and what was happening in that building tells you everything about why this story matters. Stay with me. What comes next gets specific and disturbing and absolutely necessary to understand. The October 2023 developments crystallized everything I've just described. The Biden administration announced significant sanctions relief in exchange for Venezuelan commitments to hold competitive elections. General License 44 allowed Venezuelan oil to flow more freely to international markets. The stated rationale was rewarding democratic progress. The unstated rationale was energy prices and the approaching 2024 American election cycle. And the actual reality, which is now documented in court filings, was that U.S. officials were negotiating with people who had already decided the outcome of the next election before a single vote was cast. Maduro's team understood the domestic political calculations driving American policy. They knew that high gasoline prices are politically toxic in the United States. They knew that an administration facing re-election would prioritize keeping pump prices down over maintaining ideological purity on Venezuela policy. They used that knowledge as leverage, and they used the breathing room that sanctions relief provided to prepare for what they were about to do. Which brings us to July 28, 2024. Election Day in Venezuela. And this is where we stop talking in generalities and start talking in specifics. Because what happened that day, and more importantly, what didn't happen, reveals the complete methodology of how you steal an election in the 21st century. Not theories, not allegations. Documented facts. Here's the number that tells you everything. 0. That's how many precinct-level vote tallies the Venezuelan National Electoral Council released to support Maduro's claimed victory. Not incomplete tallies, not partial data. 0 documented vote counts. In a country of 28 million people. In an election, the government insisted, was free and fair. I've covered elections across Latin America for 3 decades. I've seen fraud. I've documented irregularities. I've watched autocrats manipulate vote counts and intimidate opponents. But I've never seen a government claim electoral victory and then refuse to produce any evidence whatsoever. Not manipulated evidence. Not doctored tallies. No evidence at all. Think about what that means. You announce you won an election. The entire world asks to see the receipts. And you say no. Not, here are the receipts and they're legitimate, but just no. We won. Trust us. And anyone who questions it is a terrorist. That level of contempt for basic democratic procedure tells you The people running Venezuela stopped even pretending. And it tells you something else. They were confident they could get away with it. Which raises the question, why were they confident? The answer is in two places. First, in what actually happened at polling stations across Venezuela, and second, in what happens to people who try to expose it. We're going to cover both. And I promise you, the details are not what you've heard in mainstream coverage. But before we get granular on the fraud mechanics, I need you to understand who is running this operation. Because this isn't about incompetent authoritarians stumbling through a stolen election. This is about sophisticated criminals who've been refining these techniques for 25 years. And the person who knows exactly how it all works, the person who helped design the system, is currently in a federal detention center in Brooklyn. His name is Hugo Carvajal, El Pollo, former head of Venezuelan military intelligence, former general in the Venezuelan army, former member of Venezuela's National Assembly, and current cooperating witness for the United States Department of Justice. In June 2025, Carvajal pleaded guilty to narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, and weapons trafficking charges. He's facing life in prison. His sentencing has been delayed. And anyone who understands how federal cooperation agreements work knows exactly what that delay means. It means he's talking. It means he's providing documents. It means prosecutors are using his testimony to build cases against bigger targets. The biggest target? Nicolás Maduro, now in custody, now facing the same charges Carvajal pleaded guilty to, and now facing a trial where his former intelligence chief, a man who sat in the room when decisions were made, who ran the operations, who knows where the bodies are buried both figuratively and literally, will testify against him. But El Pollo's value isn't just what he knows about drug trafficking. It's what he knows about everything. The election fraud, the torture, the money laundering, the international network. Because when you run military intelligence for a criminal state, you see it all. And according to sources familiar with his cooperation, and we're going to detail exactly what he's prepared to testify about, he's willing to describe it all. In exchange for a reduced sentence, yes, but also, according to people who've spoken with him, because he wants it on the record. There's a letter Carvajal wrote from detention, addressed to President Trump, offering full cooperation, describing what he calls a narco-terrorist organization masquerading as a government, alleging connections between the Maduro regime and Iran, Hezbollah, and criminal networks across Latin America. Now, you might say, of course he's saying that. He's trying to reduce his sentence. He'll say whatever prosecutors want to hear. And that's a fair point. Which is why what matters isn't just his testimony. It's whether the documentary evidence supports it. And here's what's terrifying for Maduro and everyone around him. It does. U.S. prosecutors didn't arrest Maduro based on one cooperating, witness-making claims. They arrested him because they have documents, financial records, intercepted communications, and multiple witnesses. The superseding indictment unveiled after Maduro's arrest is 95 pages long. It doesn't read like a typical political prosecution. It reads like a RICO case against organized crime. Because that's what it is. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before we can understand the criminal enterprise, we need to understand the predicate. We need to understand how they maintained control, how they made sure people were too terrified to challenge them, how they ensured that even when they lost an election by landslide margins, they could still claim victory and make it stick. And that brings us back to July 28, 2024. Election Day. When the fraud happened. Not in the abstract sense of the election was unfair. In the specific, documentable sense of votes being altered, tallies being suppressed, and opponents being silenced through violence. The opposition didn't just claim they won, they proved it. Or as close to proof as you can get in these circumstances. Here's what they did. Knowing the government controlled the National Electoral Council, knowing the voting machines could be manipulated, opposition organizers created a parallel verification system. They recruited over 90,000 volunteers, organized them into groups covering individual polling stations, trained them to photograph and collect the paper tallies that voting machines were required to print. It was brilliantly simple. The regime controlled the central counting, but they couldn't control what happened at 30,000 polling stations simultaneously when witnesses were watching. By the end of election night, opposition groups had collected and digitized tallies from over 80% of polling centers across the country. They published them online, made them searchable, let anyone verify them. These weren't estimates. These were official tallies, signed by elections officials, with QR codes that could be verified, showing exactly how many votes each candidate received at each polling station. And what did those tallies show? Edmundo Gonzalez, 67% of the vote. Nicolás Maduro, 30%. Not close. Not within the margin. A complete landslide rejection of the regime. Statistical analysis by independent experts, including work published by Walter Mebane, a leading expert in electoral forensics, found no evidence of fraud in the opposition tallies. The probability that these tallies accurately reflected the vote, 99.97%. Meanwhile, the government's claimed results? Never documented, never published at the precinct level. Just the announcement. Maduro won, 51.95% to 43.18%. Trust us, the Carter Center, one of the few international observation groups Maduro allowed in the country, refused to certify the results. They called the process lacking in basic transparency and said it cannot be considered democratic. The Organization of American States published a detailed report calling it fraud. The United Nations requested that vote tallies not be destroyed. The United States recognized Gonzalez as the winner based on the opposition's documentation. But here's what's crucial to understand. And here's what most coverage has missed. The fraud wasn't sophisticated. They didn't hack voting machines in real time or employ some complex algorithm. The fraud was simple. They just announced different numbers and bet that nobody could stop them. Which raises the obvious question, why did they think they could get away with something so blatant? The answer is enforcement. Not legal enforcement, physical enforcement. And that's what we need to talk about next. Because the election fraud only makes sense when you understand what happens to people who challenge it. 25 people were killed in the protests following the election. 2,000 people were arrested. Many were held incommunicado, meaning their families didn't know where they were, couldn't contact them, couldn't confirm they were alive. And where were many of them held? In a building that's about to become central to the legal case against Maduro, a building that human rights organizations have documented, that the United Nations has investigated, that survivors have described in testimony that will be used in court. Helicoide, the shopping mall that became a torture center. And what happened there? The specific methods, the documented cases, the survivors who are now willing to testify. That's what we're covering next. Because you can't understand the fraud without understanding the enforcement mechanism. And you can't understand why people are finally talking without understanding what they're finally willing to talk about. Stay with me. We're about to go inside. Let me walk you through how the fraud actually worked, because the details matter, and because what I'm about to describe isn't speculation. It's based on testimony from election officials who fled the country, analysis by technical experts, and documentation that's now part of the evidentiary record. Venezuela uses electronic voting machines manufactured by a company called Smartmatic. In theory, these machines produce paper receipts that voters can verify. The machines tally votes digitally, but the paper trail provides a backup. It's supposed to be a secure system. But here's what former electoral workers who've since defected have described. The voting machine software was modified to allow remote access. Results could be altered in real time from central servers controlled by the National Electoral Council. The paper receipts that were supposed to provide verification, they were collected by officials who destroyed or lost any tallies that didn't match the desired outcome. Opposition poll watchers, the people supposed to observe the count and verify the tallies, were systematically excluded from voting centers. Those who tried to observe were threatened, arrested, or physically removed. By the time polls closed on July 28, 2024, regime operatives controlled most voting centers completely. But the opposition had prepared for this. Those 90,000 volunteers I mentioned, they didn't wait for permission. They were already at polling stations when the voting started. They stayed through the count. And when officials tried to confiscate the paper tallies, they'd already photographed them. The regime's response was predictable and brutal. In the hours after polls closed, as it became clear the opposition had documentation showing Maduro's loss, security forces moved against the witnesses. Freddy Superlano, national coordinator of opposition party Voluntad Popular, was chased down by 2 cars and 4 motorcycles on July 30th, 2 days after the election. Unidentified. Men dragged him and 2 others from their vehicle. His wife searched every detention center in Caracas for a week. When she finally confirmed he was in El Helicoide, officials told her she couldn't see him, couldn't call him, couldn't even confirm he was alive except for the dirty clothes they handed her with brief notes asking for food and medicine. Americo de Gracia, an opposition leader from Bolivar State, was abducted by hooded men on August 7th while on his way to a doctor's appointment. His family spent over 380 days cut off from any contact with him, 380 days not knowing if he was alive. These aren't isolated cases. According to Foro Penal, a Venezuelan human rights organization that tracks political prisoners, over 2,000 people were detained in connection with the election protests. As of February 2025, at least 926 remain in prison on political charges. Many were held in El Helicoide. And what happened there is now documented by multiple sources: Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela. The findings are consistent and horrifying. El Helicoide was built in the 1950s under dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez. It was supposed to be a futuristic shopping center, a symbol of Venezuela's oil wealth and modern aspirations. The architectural plans were exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It was going to have a 5-star hotel, a helicopter pad, luxury shops. It never opened. After sitting empty for decades, Venezuelan intelligence took it over in 1986. Under Maduro, it became the headquarters of SEBIN, the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service. And as political arrests increased, offices, storerooms, even bathrooms were converted into holding cells. Former prisoners described systematic torture, electric shocks, beatings, sexual assault, mock executions. Prolonged isolation in cells kept at near-freezing temperatures with bright lights left on 24 hours a day, a technique called white torture. One prisoner, a former judge named Maria Lourdes Afiuni, testified in court that she was sexually assaulted in El Helicoide, resulting in injuries so severe she required a hysterectomy, bladder reconstruction, and breast amputation. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture investigated and concluded that Venezuela had violated prisoners' rights and failed to investigate or punish torture. Why am I giving you these details? Because this is the enforcement mechanism. This is how you announce you won an election you clearly lost and make people afraid to challenge you. This is how you maintain control when you have no legitimacy. And this is what El Pollo knows about. Because military intelligence ran these operations. Because the decision to arrest someone, to disappear them, to send them to El Helicoide, those decisions were made by people Carvajal worked with, reported to, or commanded. But here's where it gets even more calculated. The regime didn't just use torture defensively to punish people after they challenged it. They used it proactively, as deterrence. They wanted people to know what would happen. They wanted families standing outside Helicoide, not knowing if their loved ones were alive. They wanted the uncertainty, the fear, the demonstration of power. In December 2024, the Maduro government, knowing international pressure was building, released some prisoners. According to official figures, over 300 people were freed, but human rights groups say that number is inflated, and that many who were released remained under restrictive conditions that severely limited their freedom. Then came January 3, 2026. U.S. military forces raided Caracas and captured Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. Within days, the interim government announced plans for a general amnesty law. On January 30th, interim President Delcy Rodriguez announced El Helicoide would be shut down and converted into a sports and cultural center. Families gathered outside, crying, chanting, "Freedom! Freedom!" Some got calls, some got releases. Many are still waiting. Now you might be thinking, okay, this is horrific. This is clearly a brutal authoritarian regime. But how does it connect to the fraud? To the drug trafficking? To what El Pollo is prepared to testify about? Here's the connection. All of it. The election fraud, the torture, the drug trafficking, was part of the same system. A system designed to generate money, maintain power, and crush anyone who threatened either. The Cartel of the Suns, which we're going to detail in the next section, wasn't separate from the government. According to U.S. prosecutors, it was the government. High-ranking military officers trafficking cocaine weren't rogue operators. They were following orders, or they were the ones giving orders. And the money from that trafficking? It funded the regime's survival. It paid the security forces. It maintained loyalty. It allowed Maduro and his inner circle to live like kings while the country starved. Which brings us to a contrast that's going to become central to the prosecution's case. While Maduro was negotiating with U.S. officials about oil and sanctions, while he was claiming Venezuela faced a humanitarian crisis due to American economic warfare, U.S. authorities were tracking his spending. $700 million in seized assets. Multiple mansions in Florida. Coral Gables, Sunny Isles Beach. A mansion in the Dominican Republic. 2 private jets. Dassault Falcon aircraft purchased through shell companies. 9 luxury vehicles including Rolls-Royces and Lamborghinis. Jewelry from Rolex and Patek Philippe. Gold bars. A horse breeding estate. The jets are particularly interesting. One was purchased for $13 million through a U.S.-based front company, then illegally transferred abroad for Maduro's personal use. Another was seized in the Dominican Republic while being upgraded with leather seating and luxury fittings. These weren't state assets used for official business. These were personal toys purchased with money that, according to prosecutors, came from drug trafficking and corruption. And the evidence trail, the financial records, the shell companies, the transactions, is documented. Meanwhile, according to UN statistics, over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That's more than 20% of the population. Those who remained faced hyperinflation, food shortages, collapsing healthcare, and the highest homicide rate in Latin America. The average monthly salary in Venezuela by 2024? Approximately $350. Not per hour, per month. And that's in a country sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world. This is the contrast prosecutors will present to a jury. On one side, Maduro buying multi-million-dollar jets and mansions. On the other side, Venezuelans eating from garbage, fleeing to neighboring countries, watching their children die from preventable diseases. And the money for those jets? According to the indictment and according to what El Pollo is prepared to testify, cocaine. Cocaine shipped through Venezuela with the protection and participation of the Venezuelan military and government. But we're not there yet. We still need to understand exactly what the Cartel of the Suns is, how it operated, what El Pollo's role was, and what he's prepared to reveal. We need to understand the international network, the connections to FARC, to Iran, to Hezbollah, to criminal organizations across Latin America. And we need to understand why this matters beyond Venezuela. Because the model that Maduro and Chavez perfected, combining leftist rhetoric with criminal enterprise, using the apparatus of state to protect trafficking operations, exporting that model across Latin America, that's not just Venezuelan history. That's ongoing operations in multiple countries. Stay with me. What comes next explains how a bus driver from Caracas became the head of a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise, and why his former intelligence chief is about to destroy him. Hugo Armando Carvajal Barrios, born April 1, 1960, in Puerto La Cruz, met Hugo Chavez in 1980 at the Military Academy of Venezuela, where Chavez was his instructor. Participated in the failed 1992 coup attempt that Chavez led against the government. Granted amnesty in 1994. Rose through the ranks as Chavez rose to power. By 2004, Carvajal was director of Venezuelan military intelligence. He held that position until 2011. Think about what that means. For 7 years, he was the person responsible for knowing everything the Venezuelan government needed to know. Intelligence gathering, counterintelligence, internal security, external threats, covert operations. He saw everything. He participated in everything. And now he's prepared to testify about everything. In September 2008, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control accused Carvajal of helping Colombian FARC guerrillas with drug trafficking. Specifically, protecting drug shipments from seizure, supplying weapons, and providing Venezuelan government documents to FARC members. Carvajal denied it, remained in good standing with the Chavez government, became Venezuela's consul in Aruba in 2014, though the Dutch government never accepted his credentials. In July 2014, he was arrested in Aruba on a U.S. warrant. Venezuela protested, said he had diplomatic immunity, closed airspace to flights from Aruba and Curaçao, stranding hundreds of passengers, threatened to slow operations at a major oil refinery. Within a week, Aruba released him. He flew back to Venezuela by private plane. The Netherlands declared him persona non grata. Maduro celebrated, saying, "We had a plan to escalate tension in Latin America." The message was clear. Touch our people, we'll make you pay. But then something changed. February 2019, during Venezuela's presidential crisis, Carvajal made a video. He declared support for Juan Guaidó, the opposition leader the U.S. recognized as interim president. He called for the military to break ranks and allow humanitarian aid into Venezuela. He criticized Maduro's presidency. Maduro expelled him from the armed forces, degraded his rank, accused him of treason. Carvajal fled to Spain. Spanish authorities arrested him in April 2019 at U.S. request. A Spanish court initially rejected extradition. The decision was appealed and overturned. But by then, Carvajal had disappeared. He hid in Madrid for 2 years. September 2021, Spanish police found him. 2 years later, 2023, he was extradited to the United States. June 25, 2025, he pleaded guilty. Narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, weapons trafficking, charges that carry a life sentence. His sentencing? Delayed. Still pending as of February 2026, which tells you everything you need to know about what's happening behind closed doors. When a federal defendant pleads guilty to life sentence charges and sentencing gets delayed, there's usually one reason: cooperation. The government wants his testimony for other cases. They're using information he's providing to build prosecutions against bigger targets. The biggest target is now in custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, the same facility where Carvajal is held. Nicolás Maduro and Hugo Carvajal, once allies, now prisoner and witness. So what is El Pollo prepared to testify about? Based on court documents, his plea agreement, and reports from his attorney, here's what we know. First, the Cartel of the Suns. The name comes from the sun, insignias worn by Venezuelan generals. According to U.S. prosecutors, and according to what Carvajal has admitted, it's not a traditional drug cartel. It's a network of high-ranking military officers who used their positions to facilitate drug trafficking. The indictment alleges the cartel had an express objective: to flood the United States with cocaine, not just for profit, as a deliberate act against American society. Carvajal's admitted role: he helped FARC, the Colombian guerrilla group, designated as a terrorist organization, move cocaine through Venezuela. He provided protection. He supplied weapons. He gave them Venezuelan government documents. One specific shipment prosecutors have detailed: May 2006. A DC-9 aircraft landed in Ciudad del Carmen, Mexico, carrying 5.5 tons of cocaine. The flight originated from Venezuela. Carvajal and Diosdado Cabello, now Venezuela's interior minister, allegedly coordinated it. 5.5 tons, that's over 12,000 pounds. Street value in the U.S.? Hundreds of millions of dollars. But here's what makes that shipment particularly interesting. The aircraft was owned by two shadowy American companies. The ownership trail points toward possible U.S. intelligence involvement, though details remain murky. What's clear is that Carvajal knows exactly what happened, who authorized it, where the money went, who else was involved, and he's prepared to testify. Second, the structure. According to court filings, the Cartel of the Suns wasn't just drug trafficking. It was narco-terrorism, collaboration with designated terrorist groups, use of drug proceeds to fund operations, weapons trafficking, money laundering on a massive scale. Carvajal's letter from detention, the one addressed to Trump, goes further. He alleges connections between the Maduro regime and Iran, Hezbollah, and criminal networks across Latin America. He describes what he calls a narco-terrorist organization that used the Venezuelan state as cover. If accurate, and remember, prosecutors wouldn't be pursuing this without corroborating evidence, it means Venezuela under Maduro wasn't just a corrupt government. It was a node in an international criminal network connecting South American drug cartels, Middle Eastern terrorist organizations, and hostile governments. Third, the money. Where did it go? According to investigators, into real estate, into shell companies, into offshore accounts. Some of it funded the regime's operations. Some of it funded personal enrichment. Those $700 million in seized assets I mentioned earlier? That's just what U.S. authorities found in Western jurisdictions. The NGO Transparencia Venezuela estimates Maduro's total wealth at $3.8 billion. Much of it allegedly held through frontmen in countries that don't cooperate with U.S. law enforcement: Russia, China, Iran, Turkey. Fourth, the enforcement. Carvajal ran military intelligence, which means he oversaw the security apparatus, which means he knows who gave orders for arrests, disappearances, torture. He knows which officials at El Helicoide were following policy versus acting independently. He knows how decisions were made and by whom. This is crucial for the prosecution. Because proving drug trafficking is one thing. Proving it was a systematic government operation is another. And that's what Carvajal can provide. The chain of command, the decision-making process, the integration of trafficking operations with government functions. Fifth, the international network. Remember the Foro de São Paulo I mentioned earlier? that organization of leftist parties across Latin America? Carvajal would have insight into how Venezuela used oil money and drug money to fund political movements throughout the region. In 2007, Argentine authorities intercepted a Venezuelan government official carrying a suitcase with $800,000 in cash, allegedly to fund the presidential campaign of Nestor Kirchner. That was just what got caught. Carvajal would know about the payments that didn't get caught. He would know which parties got funding, which politicians received support, how the money was moved, what Venezuela expected in return. Because moving that kind of money internationally requires intelligence services, and he was running those services. Now, is Carvajal credible? That's what defense attorneys will attack. He's a convicted narco-terrorist. He's facing life in prison. He'll say whatever he needs to say to reduce his sentence. But here's why prosecutors are confident. They don't need to rely only on his testimony. He's providing documents, financial records, communications, names, dates, amounts, stuff that can be verified independently. And they have other witnesses. The indictment mentions multiple cooperating individuals. Carvajal isn't the only insider who flipped. He's just the highest-ranking one we know about. The trial strategy is likely modeled on the Manuel Noriega prosecution. Noriega, the Panamanian dictator, was captured by U.S. forces in 1990, tried in federal court in Miami, convicted on drug trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering charges based largely on testimony from cooperating witnesses who'd taken plea deals. Noriega got 40 years. He died in prison. Maduro is facing the same charges, the same legal team, the same district court, and potentially the same outcome. But the impact goes beyond one trial. Because what El Pollo is revealing isn't just about Maduro, it's about a model of governance that was exported across Latin America, a model that combined leftist rhetoric with criminal enterprise, that used anti-imperialism as cover for trafficking, that presented itself as revolutionary while enriching a small elite. And that model? It's still active in multiple countries. Which is why what happens in this trial matters far beyond Venezuela. But before we can understand the broader implications, we need to understand one more piece: how this system was exported. How Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro became the center of a network spanning the hemisphere. How oil money and drug money funded political movements. And how that network, the Foro de São Paulo, shaped Latin American politics for 3 decades. Stay with me for the final chapter, because this is where we connect Venezuela's collapse to the broader story of Latin American politics, where we explain how a regional organization became a vehicle for authoritarian expansion, and where we answer the question: what happens now that the money's gone and the witnesses are talking? In 1990, 2 men met in São Paulo, Brazil. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, leader of Brazil's Workers' Party, and Fidel Castro, Cuba's communist dictator. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The global communist project appeared dead. They created an organization, a forum for leftist parties across Latin America and the Caribbean to coordinate strategy, share tactics, and work toward common goals. They called it the Foro de São Paulo, the São Paulo Forum. The official mission: debate alternatives to neoliberalism, find ways to resist American influence, promote social justice and economic equality. The actual function: create a network for coordinating leftist electoral victories across the hemisphere and maintaining power once achieved, with Venezuela's oil money funding it all. The first meeting in São Paulo attracted 48 parties and organizations. Today, the forum claims over 100 member parties representing organizations across 32 countries. And here's what's remarkable: it worked. Hugo Chavez, elected president of Venezuela in 1998, immediately put Venezuela's enormous oil revenues at the forum's disposal. Suddenly, leftist parties throughout Latin America had funding for campaigns, for media, for organization. Lula won Brazil's presidency in 2002. Nestor Kirchner won Argentina in 2003. Evo Morales won Bolivia in 2005. Rafael Correa won Ecuador in 2006. Daniel Ortega returned to power in Nicaragua in 2007. By the early 2010s, Forum-affiliated governments controlled most of South and Central America. They called it the Pink Tide, a wave of progressive leftist governments sweeping the region, implementing social programs, challenging American influence, building regional integration independent of Washington. And on paper, some of it looked good. Poverty reduction in Brazil, social programs in Bolivia, constitutional reforms giving more power to indigenous populations, resistance to free trade agreements that many saw as exploitative. But there was another side, the side that Carvajal knows about, the side that prosecutors are now documenting, because Venezuela wasn't just funding campaigns. According to allegations that have surfaced over the years, including the Antonini-Wilson scandal in Argentina, it was funneling cash to candidates. Not disclosed campaign contributions. Suitcases full of money. In 2007, Argentine authorities caught Guido Antonini-Wilson, a Venezuelan-American businessman, with $800,000 in cash. He'd arrived from Caracas on a private flight with Venezuelan government officials. The money, according to testimony, was intended for Kirchner's campaign. That's what got caught. How much didn't get caught? Venezuela also created Petrocaribe, an oil agreement with Central American and Caribbean nations. Essentially, Venezuela would provide oil at below-market prices with generous financing terms. In exchange, those governments would support Venezuela politically at the UN, the OAS, and other international bodies. It created a voting bloc. Small countries dependent on Venezuelan oil supporting whatever position Maduro took, abstaining when the OAS tried to condemn human rights violations, blocking resolutions, providing diplomatic cover. But as Venezuela's economy collapsed, as oil production fell from 3 million barrels per day to less than 700,000, the money dried up. Petrocaribe deliveries stopped. The funding for Forum-affiliated parties decreased. The model started failing. And as it failed, something became visible that the oil money had obscured. Many of these governments weren't actually progressive. They were corrupt, authoritarian, criminal. Lula was convicted of corruption in Brazil's car wash scandal, though the conviction was later annulled on procedural grounds. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was convicted of corruption in Argentina. Rafael Correa fled Ecuador facing corruption charges. Evo Morales tried to steal an election in Bolivia in 2019 and fled when protests erupted. In Venezuela, Colombia, and Nicaragua, governments that came to power through the Forum stood accused of far worse. Not just corruption, human rights violations, political repression. In Maduro's case, drug trafficking and crimes against humanity. The International Criminal Court opened an investigation into Venezuela in 2018. The charges, crimes against humanity including murder, imprisonment, torture, rape, and persecution. The investigation is ongoing. If Maduro is convicted in U.S. court, the ICC evidence becomes even more relevant. The Forum never condemned any of this. When Maduro stole the 2024 election, when the fraud was documented by opposition tallies showing a 40-point loss, the Forum either stayed silent or actively supported him. Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, all with Forum-affiliated governments, refused to condemn the fraud, asked for dialogue and verification while people were being tortured in El Helicoide. The Forum's 2024 meeting praised the advances in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, three of the most repressive regimes in the hemisphere, and it condemned the blockade of Cuba and sanctions against Venezuela, without mentioning the political prisoners, the torture, the disappearances. This is the organization that shaped Latin American politics for 3 decades. This is what Venezuelan oil money built. And this is what's now collapsing as the money runs out and the criminal prosecutions begin. Because it's not just Maduro facing charges. Diosdado Cabello, Venezuela's interior minister and alleged co-leader of the Cartel of the Suns, is under indictment. Multiple Venezuelan military officers have been sanctioned or charged. The network is being systematically dismantled. And here's where it gets interesting for current politics. Many forum-affiliated parties are still in power, still implementing policies, still connected to each other through the network. But the model they followed, the Venezuela model of using state resources for political consolidation while engaging in corruption and repression, is now completely discredited. No one wants to be Venezuela. Even leftist governments distance themselves from Maduro, because Venezuela is no longer an example of socialist success. It's an example of catastrophic failure and criminal government. 7 million refugees. Hyperinflation that peaked at over 130,000% annually. Healthcare collapse so complete that hospitals lack basic supplies. Food shortages requiring people to eat from garbage. The highest murder rate in Latin America outside war zones. This is what the model produced. And this is what prosecutors will present to a jury as context for why Maduro and his associates did what they allegedly did. Why they trafficked drugs. Why they stole elections. Why they tortured opponents. Because maintaining the appearance of success required crushing any challenge to the narrative. But the narrative is dead. And now comes the reckoning. On January 30th, 2026, Interim President Delcy Rodriguez announced a general amnesty law. Political prisoners from the Chavista era, potentially covering cases back to 1999, could be released. El Helicoide would close. The oil sector would open to private investment. These aren't reforms Maduro would have implemented. They're emergency measures from a government trying to establish legitimacy after the boss got arrested, trying to signal to the US, to Europe, to international institutions, we're different, we're changing. Whether they succeed is an open question. Whether the changes are genuine or cosmetic is an open question. But what's not in question is that the Venezuela model is finished. The trial of Nicolás Maduro will be the most significant prosecution of a head of state since Noriega. The testimony from Carvajal and other cooperating witnesses will be the most detailed insider account of how a narco-state operated that we've ever had access to. The documentary evidence, the financial records, the communications, the operational details will be unprecedented. And the implications extend far beyond one trial. Because every forum-affiliated government, every party that took Venezuelan money, every politician who looked the other way while Maduro tortured opponents and trafficked cocaine, they're all watching. They're all calculating. They're all wondering what El Pollo knows about them. There are sealed indictments. There are ongoing investigations. There are other cooperating witnesses we don't know about yet. The network that Venezuela built over 25 years is being mapped, documented, and dismantled. This is why Maduro's arrest wasn't just about one dictator. It was about destroying a model and sending a message. You cannot run a criminal state indefinitely. Eventually, the witnesses talk. Eventually, the money gets traced. Eventually, you end up in a courtroom answering for what you did. The Foro de São Paulo will continue. Forum-affiliated parties will continue governing in multiple countries. But they can't use the Venezuela model anymore. They can't rely on oil money that doesn't exist. They can't point to Venezuela as proof that their approach works. And they can't ignore that one of the most powerful men in the network, a man who saw it all, who participated in it all, who knows where all the bodies are buried, is sitting in a federal detention center in Brooklyn, preparing to testify. The story of Venezuela's collapse is many things. It's a story of economic mismanagement, of authoritarian consolidation, of international isolation. But at its core, it's a story about what happens when criminals take control of a state and use its resources for personal enrichment, while telling a story about revolution and social justice. And now it's becoming a story about accountability, about evidence, about testimony, about justice, delayed for 25 years, but finally arriving. If you found this investigation valuable, share it. Because the mainstream coverage of Venezuela has been incomplete at best. We were told it was about socialism versus capitalism, about sanctions and economic warfare, about geopolitical competition. And those elements exist. But the real story, the story that court documents are now confirming, that Carvajal is prepared to testify about, that prosecutors are building piece by piece, is simpler and darker. It's about organized crime, about a drug cartel that captured a government, about torture used to maintain control, about election fraud protected by fear. And it's about what happens when that system finally faces real consequences. The trial hasn't started yet. The testimony hasn't been heard. But the evidence is compiled. The witnesses are cooperating. And the world is about to get the most detailed look inside a criminal state that we've ever had. Remember this. Every specific claim in this investigation is based on documented sources. Court filings, human rights reports, financial records, witness testimony. Nothing here is speculation. It's all on the record. And there's more to come. Because what we've covered today, the fraud, the torture, the trafficking, the network, that's what's public. Imagine what's still sealed. Imagine what Carvajal knows that hasn't been disclosed yet. Imagine what other witnesses are prepared to testify about. The story of Venezuela isn't over. It's entering its final chapter. And this time, it's being written in federal court, where evidence matters, where witnesses testify under oath, where lies can't survive cross-examination. The Maduro files are open. The investigation is complete. The trial is coming, and the truth, the full, documented, testified to truth, is about to become public record. Subscribe for deep investigations that go beyond headlines into the mechanisms that drive history. The truth is always more complex and more important than the simplified version we're sold.